Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 6th Biennial Catholic Social Tradition Conference of the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. This year's theme is Justice in the World. The Center would like to thank the National Center for the Laity for being a co-sponsor of the Justice in the World Conference this year. My name is Bill Purcell. I am the Acting Executive Director of the Center for Social Concerns. I am also the Catholic Social Tradition Minor Co-Director, and I actually founder of this conference 10 years ago. We just want to make an announcement to make sure that folks know this evening the closed captioning with the Zoom, it's a national problem with Zoom this evening, is not working for those who are hoping that closed captioning. We're hoping that Zoom will have this fixed by tomorrow. So let us begin this evening with prayer, and let us pray. Embracing God, thank you for this opportunity to reflect on your love. Let us learn through the conference to truly love our neighbors so we can have a more just and humane world. Strengthen us to have the eyes to see and the courage to act, to build the structures of truth and compassion. May these days provide us hope for the journey ahead. May Jesus be our guide, and may the Spirit encourage us in our initiatives going forward. We ask this in your name. Amen. Again, welcome. This Justice in the World Conference celebrates the 50th anniversary of the World Synod of Bishops' prophetic vision by examining the justice issues proclaimed by the gospel and addressed by modern Catholic social thought. Together, over the next few days, we will focus in particular on issues central to the document: racism, ecclesial and political structures, work, internationalization, and the environment. This document, Justice in the World, has much to offer the Church and the world in moving forward. The most famous line of the document, which I very hold dear, is action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel in number 6. So our calling is to act for justice if we are to faithfully live the gospel. And in order to educate ourselves further on how to act, the Center for Social Concerns has created a new Catholic Social Tradition CST video. We will premiere this video this evening, and our aim is to introduce CST in a contemporary visual language that demonstrates the concrete practicality of the principles. We now hope you enjoy this video.
We make many decisions every day, some apparently simple. What do I want for breakfast? How will I get into the city on Saturday?
Some are more complex. How should I respond when a coworker makes a racially charged remark? What kind of a career should I pursue?
But how often do we pause to consider where our food comes from, or the environmental impact of our travel?
In choosing a job, do we think beyond the paycheck and consider how workplace cultures can elevate some people over others? Or how our work might contribute to the common good?
Catholic Social Tradition, or CST, invites us to ask questions like this. It begins with the Gospels, what Jesus said and did. As a living tradition, CST also includes the teachings of the Hebrew prophets, and 2,000 years of people responding to Jesus' example and teaching.
In each new generation, the Church continues to develop CST through social teaching documents. For example, Pope Francis in Laudato Si calls us to care for the earth as our common home, and in Fratelli Tutti, he challenges us to treat all people as our brothers and sisters, no matter how different we may seem.
When people talk about Catholic social tradition, they often talk about principles. But it's more than that. It's a call to action to create a more just world, an invitation to be part of a living tradition, and a challenge to think and see anew in light of a biblical vision of justice.
CST helps us think beyond ourselves. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it helps us question the easy answers that pass as conventional wisdom. And it stirs us to work toward a world where every single person has a seat at the table.
Thank you for letting us share this video with you. Again, we encourage those who want to use that. It's at the Center for Social Concerns website, and to share that in ways of educating about CST. And lastly, a further way to act on justice is to recognize the justice leaders who brought us here today. And tonight we recognize Holy Cross Sister Judith Ann Beatty, who's here this evening with me. Sister Judith Ann is receiving the inaugural Father Don McNeil CSC, Sister Judith Ann Beatty CSC Award for Social Concerns from the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame for being an exemplar of social justice, as well as one of the founders of the center. More than 40 years ago, Judith Ann's contribution to the creation of the Center for Social Concerns was invaluable. Judith made the vision of the CSC a reality, which at the time was acknowledged by many. Her deep spirituality has allowed her to enter into the lives of the poor and suffering through her various ministries. As a nurse, as a director of Notre Dame's volunteer service program, to co-directing the CSC with Don McNeil, to serving as a spiritual guide. It is fitting that she is receiving this award at the 50-year celebration of justice in the world by the World Synod of Bishops. Judith Ann has contributed her prophetic voice to advance social justice throughout her life. And I want to congratulate Sister Judith Ann, who joins me here. We have this award we'd like to present her, which has the words of Micah, of act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. It says the Reverend Don McNeil, CSC, and Sister Judith Ann Beatty, CSC Award for Social Justice, awarded biannually for exemplary commitment to social justice. And other parts of the award to go with it, we will present with her, and I'm going to invite Sister Judith Ann to say a few words.
I am honored and deeply grateful to receive this award. I am saddened that Father Don McNeil is not here to receive it with me. He passed away 3.5 years ago. I believe his spirit is very present at this special time. Don was a priest who possessed vision, very inclusive and collaborative, always encouraging women to take leadership and reaching out to people on the margins. He invited me to work with him in developing and implementing the vision and mission and what eventually became the Center for Social Concerns. We were inspired by the call in Micah to act justly, live mercifully, and act humbly with your God. And also the Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes. This document speaks of the baptismal call of discipleship to all believers, active participation of the laity in the life of the church, and the challenge to read the signs of the times that included identifying the injustices present. Micah's call and Gaudium et Spes were foundational to our vision and mission in developing the center. In reading the signs of the times, we were aware for the need to prepare lay people to participate in the mission of the church in addressing social injustices. We saw the mission of the center to educate and form students in the mission of the church regarding social justice. We did this through theology courses that focused on Catholic social tradition, various social justice issues, and service. Part of the coursework included immersion experiences where students would encounter people on the margins. Here they discovered the face of social injustice. The stories of people on the margins often touched the hearts of the students and revealed our shared humanity. These people became teachers of our students. Students were inspired and experienced the witness also of Christians they saw working on behalf of justice in their placements. Returning to the classroom, they were invited to reflect theologically on their experience, raising questions, and putting these into dialogue with the Catholic social tradition, articulating learnings and responses to injustices. Oftentimes, life-changing questions surfaced in these students. The founding of the Center for Social Concerns happened because Father Hesburgh listened to our proposal, endorsed it, and supported it. He believed in our mission of educating and forming students in service and Catholic social tradition. We had a staff of lay people that were dedicated, generous, and believed in the mission and vision and helped us implement it. Early on, we worked with a small group of students who articulated their vision for social justice, assisted us in making concrete the mission, and making suggestions as to how they could see us using resources. It gives me great joy to see how the mission of the center not only continues, but has grown and is carefully tended by the staff that are committed and dedicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Judith Ann. It's great that we can celebrate you as the founder of the center and for all the work you've done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you. Again, we're very privileged that Judith Ann could be here to receive this award. But now, let me turn the conference over to Dr. Adam Gustine, our interim seminars and future, soon to be a regular director of seminars at the Center for Social Concerns, who will lead our racial justice panel this evening. This panel tonight includes our opening speaker from our CST conference 10 years ago, Father Bryan Massingale, as well as Bishop Seitz of El Paso, and Dr. Shannon D. Williams from Villanova. Thank you all, great to see you. I'm gonna turn things over to Adam.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Bill said, my name is Adam Gustine, and I direct the seminars program here at the Center for Social Concerns, and I will be your moderator tonight. As we open the CST conference themed after the important pastoral letter, Justice in the World, we do so gathering around a critical topic at a critical time, the topic of racial justice. And as the shootings in Atlanta just under 2 weeks ago remind us, the sins of racism and white supremacy are still a violent malignancy in our nation and in our lives. So before we begin in earnest tonight, I would invite you to join me in a moment of reflection or prayer for those who have lost their lives, both in Atlanta and in the many generations of our bloody history to the violence of racism. Thank you. It's truly important for us to gather around this topic tonight, to think together about what it means not only to stand against white supremacy and racial hatred in name only, but also to foster the vision and the courage to act against injustice and to pursue the dismantling of systems, structures, dispositions, and values that give rise to violence, oppression, and the invasive growth of racialized hatred that extends into every corner of society. As Justice in the World noted, our world is a growing, quote, network of domination, oppression, and abuses which stifle freedom and which keep the greater part of humanity from sharing in the building up and enjoyment of a more just and loving world, end quote. That stifling is what we seek to wrestle with tonight. Throughout the presentations that you'll be hearing, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions for our panelists, and you can submit that question via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will assemble those questions and direct them to the panelists at the end of our time, and we apologize in advance as we will unlikely be able to address each question. Tonight, though, we are grateful to have with us three presenters who have established themselves in both the academic and practical sense as leaders in the work of racial justice, in particular connected to the church. I have no doubt that tonight we will be challenged, disrupted, and also invited to consider for ourselves the role that each of us, individually and together as people of faith and goodwill, have to play in the pursuit of racial justice. We'll hear from Father Bryan Massingale, the James and Nancy Buckman Chair of Applied Christian Ethics at Fordham University's Department of Theology. We will also hear from Dr. Shannon D. Williams, the Albert LePage Assistant Professor of History at Villanova University. And I will share more about Father Massingale and Dr. Williams at the outset of their remarks. But starting us off tonight is Bishop Mark Seitz. Bishop Seitz is the 6th Bishop of the Catholic Diocese of El Paso, Texas, and is the author of the pastoral letter, Night Will Be No More, originally written in response to the 2019 massacre in El Paso, Texas, that was called the deadliest attack to target Latinos in modern American history. Night Will Be No More is a stirring call to the people of God to reject the sins of racism and white supremacy, whether in our hearts or in society. Bishop Seitz writes that doing so is a Christian imperative, and the cost of not facing these issues head on weighs much more heavily on those who live the reality of discrimination. Bishop Seitz was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and ordained a priest in the Diocese of Dallas in 1979 after completing undergraduate and graduate studies at the University of Dallas. In 2013, Pope Francis appointed Bishop Seitz as the 6th Bishop of El Paso. As the prelate serving the borderland community, whose sister city is Ciudad Juarez in Chihuahua, the bishop has focused his work and heart on the poor and vulnerable, including migrant families and refugees who have made their home in this region or who choose the community as their point of passage. The bishop believes that migrants add inestimable value to the communities where they choose to live and that parishes and community members should welcome them with compassion, love, and solidarity. We are so grateful to have him with us this evening. Would you all please join me in welcoming Bishop Mark Seitz.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me. I'm honored to be on this panel with my fellow panelists. If we hope to make headway on issues of race, it's important that the voices of people of color be heard first, with open hearts, and to receive their guidance along the path of justice and reconciliation. But there's not room for any of us to sit on the sidelines in this struggle. As I hope to suggest, each of us needs to contribute what we can in first facing our own participation, both passive and active, in structures of racism. Once we have begun some heartfelt soul searching, then we need to encourage our sisters and brothers to come along. Not only African Americans need to be proclaiming that their lives matter. Whenever and wherever human dignity is threatened, we need to speak and act. I work and minister in the desert Southwest, which is an amazing place of rich culture, history, and diversity. It's also been a place of continuous migration. First, the migration of indigenous families of peoples through the region for millennia. Then the Spanish in the 16th century, a wave of migration from the white Americans in the 19th century, the great Mexican migration in the 20th, and today the great Central American exodus, which is pushing forced migration towards our region. For all the beauty and diversity, the region has also long been a place of subordination based on skin color and caste. Indigenous communities, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Blacks, mulattoes, and mestizos have all suffered racial discrimination and racial terror for centuries. The people of the region, including the migrants who pass through our region, have long been subject to waves of colonization. The Spanish, which introduced racial hierarchies against the indigenous, the American expansion westward, which introduced violent racial hierarchies against all people of color, and the ongoing colonization of the global economy of exclusion, which erects racial hierarchies with things like passports, immigration status, and border walls. As a pastor on the border who has witnessed the effects of these waves of colonization, this has taught me that all these racial hierarchies are introduced in the service of or maintaining power, privilege, and social and economic advantage, of maintaining what Isabel Wilkerson calls caste. And while acknowledging all the progress that has been made, as Wilkerson says in her book, racism experienced by one generation has ripple effects through time. It is a sin visited on succeeding generations, and it lives on in bias and structures of supremacy that we wear like we do a pair of sunglasses, often unaware of our altered vision. It lives on in the violence that we've recently seen against the Asian American community. It lives on in the 2019 massacre of Latinos in El Paso. And so the first imperative for us as people of faith and as a country is to challenge racism and white supremacy, whether in our hearts or in society. This is hard. But the cost of not facing these issues head on weighs much more heavily on those who live the reality of discrimination. I've often reflected on the role of the church in a situation like this. First, we must look inward to purify ourselves of our own responsibility and make sure our own house is in order. We must look also, as Benedict XVI said, get off the sidelines and walk with Christ, present in the suffering of people of color and migrants through tangible solidarity and work for justice. And I would say there are further areas for exploration. We are in Lent. The church bears within her a sacred cycle of penance, contrition, and forgiveness. The challenge, I believe, for people of faith is to discern how we might make room for the Spirit to enact this sacred cycle in our day, here in the United States, here in the fallout of centuries of discrimination and hatred. I'll share one thought on this, and it comes from my journey walking with migrants. The word amnesty has long gotten a bad rap. But remember, all of us have benefited from the greatest of amnesties given to us on the cross. We may think the invitation of providence and history today is for our country to offer amnesty to migrants and reparations to the descendants of slavery and today's victims of racism. That is true. But the inverse may also be true. Maybe it is the other way around. Remember the Emmaus story, how the disciples, dejected and weak in faith, walk away from Jerusalem. God interrupts their journey and reorients them. Perhaps our country's Emmaus journey today is with Christ present in the migrant and the oppressed flesh of Black humanity. Well, then, it's not so much about offering amnesty to them with a Jesus who offers an outstretched hand of mercy. We need to seek amnesty for how we have treated them. We've got to, as Pope Francis says, build a world that isn't about us and them, but a greater we. That can only come about with penance, contrition, and reconciliation. And make no mistake, this can't be a contrived pardon or an easy absolution. There's no restitution that will ever make up for what has been done, but we need to do what we can. Contrition involves a serious amendment of purpose. It involves reparation. And more profoundly, it involves me setting aside all fear and being in relationship with you and becoming a little different because of it. And you being in relationship with me and being a little different too. We need deep relationships to lay down the weapons of fear, a solidarity that changes us and which puts us on a new path and opens up new channels of transformative love. How can we make space as a church for the request and reception of pardon and forgiveness? How can the body of Christ play a role in bringing about transformative healing, solidarity in America in 2021? That is real hard work. And that is the work we ought to be doing as a church, because we in America need to seek forgiveness. We in America need amnesty. And we need hope. The Black church in the United States, Catholic and Protestant, has given us one of the most sublime expressions of what it means to be people of God in the history of Christianity. Undeniably, hope even in what Dr. Cornel West calls the funk of dehumanization and brutality. Subversiveness and depth of culture through deep literacy and the Word of God, resistance, infidelity. In Father Bryan's book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, he notes that the struggle for racial justice and for the beloved community in the United States doesn't make sense if we don't acknowledge a transrational element. There has to be a supernatural fire that has fueled the struggle for justice in the face of so much spirit-crushing brutality and so many reversals. We've got to be, as the Gospels say, Jesus was, moved in our belly. The history of the Black church is a lived demonstration of something we need to take from this conference and this panel, that a faith credible must make history. In other words, a church that prays must be a church that moves its feet. For that to happen, though, we need hope. Only hope and fire can get us through the funk, through the struggle, through the pain and disappointment. The history of the Black church in the United States is a history of hope writ large. It comes from laying on the bosom of the suffering Redeemer. This is something our church must also be attentive to. We need to give people a reason for hope. We need to show people the unrelenting love of the suffering God. To conclude, I want to quote John Lewis, may he rest in peace, who brings it all together. Prayer is one of the most powerful, well, I don't want to call it a weapon, but it's a tool, an instrument, a way of reaching out that humankind has. We can and we do use it to deal with problems and the things and issues that we don't understand, that we don't quite comprehend. It's very hard to separate the essence of prayer and faith. We pray because we believe that praying can make what we believe, our dreams and our visions, come true. There's an old African proverb, when you pray, move your feet. As a nation, if we care for the beloved community, we must move with our feet, our hearts and our resources to build and not to tear down, to reconcile and not to divide, to love and not to hate, to heal and not to kill. In the final analysis, we are one people, one family, one house, the American house, the American family. Thank you all. God bless you.
Bishop Seitz, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. Just a reminder to everyone that you do have the opportunity to submit questions to any or all of our presenters through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Our second presenter tonight is Dr. Shannon D. Williams. Dr. Shannon D. Williams is a historian of the African American experience with research and teaching specializations in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history. She's completing her first book, Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle, with Duke University Press. Dr. Williams' research has been supported by a host of fellowships, grants, and awards, including a Scholar in Residence Fellowship at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City, a Charlotte W. Newcomb Doctoral Fellowship in Religion and Ethics from the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation, an Albert J. Beveridge Grant from the American Historical Association, the Huggins Quarles Award from the Organization of American Historians, and the John Tracy Ellis Dissertation Award from the American Catholic Historical Association. Dr. Williams did her doctoral studies at Rutgers University and her work has been published in the Journal of African American History, American Catholic Studies, America Magazine, the National Catholic Reporter, the Catholic News Service, and Religion Dispatches. Dr. Williams is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. In 2018, she received the inaugural Sister Christine Schenck Award for Young Catholic Leadership from Future Church for using history to foster racial justice and reconciliation in religious congregations of women. We are thrilled that she is joining us tonight, and we look forward to hearing from Dr. Shannon D. Williams. Dr. Williams, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It is truly a privilege to be in digital community with you for the 2021 Justice in the World Conference, and I am deeply humbled to be in conversation with my esteemed panelists. I also, before I begin my remarks, I would like to also extend my congratulations to Sister Judith Ann Beatty for receiving the inaugural CST Social Concerns Award. So many of the challenges that we face as a global society require the courageous and tenacious leadership of individuals unafraid to be prophetic, to tell the truth out loud, and to do the often thankless work of organizing, mobilizing, and serving. So often, those who do this work do not receive their roses receive their roses due to them in their lifetime. So it's always wonderful to be present at an opportunity where to bear witness to such celebration. So thank you. My remarks tonight will focus primarily on my public advocacy over the past few years, which has called upon the Catholic Church to formally acknowledge and apologize for its histories of colonialism, slavery, segregation, and racial exclusion, to call upon the Church to begin to institutionalize the teaching of Black and Brown Catholic history within its institutions, and also for the Church to take leading roles in campaigns designed to protect the lives of the most vulnerable, to address racial disparities in healthcare, and also to address concerns related to police violence and demanding police accountability. I believe so much of this advocacy is grounded in my belief of the ethical and moral necessity of Black Catholic historical truth-telling. I believe that this historical truth-telling can be one of our most powerful tools of anti-racism and must be the foundation for actualizing racial justice in the Church through reparation for the histories of slavery, segregation, and exclusion. Indeed, I, as a historian of the Black experience, have long understood that the greatest weapon of white supremacy has never been its violence, but rather the ability to erase the history of its violence and its victims. Indeed, so much of my work is not only born out of the protest of last summer with regard to the protests against white supremacy and the police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, but also is rooted in my own experience researching the lives and labors of the nation's Black Catholic nuns. Indeed, my current research was born out of an attempt really to make sense of an extraordinary news story and photograph that I stumbled upon in early 2007. At the time, I was in graduate school searching for a research topic in a seminar in African American history, and I had taken to scanning microfilmed editions of African American owned newspapers looking for that title. And I finally came across a story from 1968 announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference. And the article's title alone, Black Sisters Weigh Contradictions in Christian and Secular Community, piqued my interest. But it was really the accompanying photograph of 4 smiling Black Catholic sisters that steadied my hand on the microfilm reader that day. Until that moment, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black nun except in a Hollywood film. In fact, the only Black sister that I knew at that time was Sister Mary Clarence, the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the critically acclaimed film franchise Sister Act. Deeply ashamed of my ignorance, I soon learned that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education, and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame, was unaware of the existence of Black nuns in our church. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah, Georgia, when I was growing up. Stunned by my mother's revelation, I became determined to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and also understand the roots of the invisibility of Black Catholic sisters in our lives. From Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the US Black Catholic community, I learned among many things that there had actually been Black nuns in my mother's hometown of Savannah, Georgia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before anti-Black prejudice and violent threats from within and outside of the church pushed these holy women out, members of 2 all-Black sisterhoods had helped to lay the foundation for and ensure the survival of the Black Catholic educational system in the city. This was the system that had made my mother's journey, and by extension, my own journey into Catholicism possible. Yet the white sisters and priests who taught my mom and hundreds of other Black children never once, and taught them during America's civil rights years, never once alluded to the history of Black sisters in their lessons. And according to my mother, her white instructors never taught any Black history or art either. And after calling and writing a host of Catholic institutions to track down some of the sisters and ex-sisters who had established the National Black Sisters Conference, I finally began to understand why. The saga of America's Black women who dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold, wrote Sister M. Shawn Copeland in 1975. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma of racism, but also because the position of a woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. Now, by the time that I interviewed Dr. Copeland, she was then a distinguished professor at Boston College, the first African-American president of the Catholic Theological Society, and she had been out of religious life for some time. But in the 1960s and the 1970s, Dr. Copeland, who had become the first Black Felician sister in Detroit and later served as an Adrian Dominican sister, had been one of the organization's most visible leaders. And she had, among many people, done perhaps the most to sort of preserve their history. And in our first conversation, she said, you know, I'm so glad that you're interested in this story. We've been waiting on someone to tell this story. And while her willingness to share her story with me certainly proved pivotal, it was really the conversation with Dr. Patricia Gray, the National Black Sisters Conference founding president, and one of the 4 nuns that I saw in that photograph who really sort of changed sort of the focus of my research, from thinking only about sort of the members of the National Black Sisters Conference to this larger and richer history of Black Catholic sisters in the United States. Now, by the time that I met her, initially, she didn't want to talk about her experiences. I don't like to look back, she said over and over again during our first conversation. But after some time, she did change her mind. And among many things, she encouraged me to expand my focus beyond sort of Black sisters in the Black freedom struggle, specifically in the 1960s and 1970s, to sort of think larger about sort of the history of the Black sisterhoods, but also those members of Black women who desegregated white communities that the National Black Sisters Conference was not able to contact. And she said something that has stuck with me forever. We were not the first Black sisters to revolt in the church. If you can, try to tell all of our stories. And with this charge, I simply said, I'll do my best, and my best is pretty good. And so for the next 13 years, I went in search of these stories. And I found no accounts bearing any resemblance to the fabled Hollywood tale of Sister Mary Clarence. And I also failed to encounter Black sisters whose lived experiences confirmed many of the existing narratives of US Catholicism and the master story of sisters in the United States. Instead, from a host of previously ignored sources, I bore witness to a profoundly unfamiliar history that disrupts and revises much of what has been said and written about the US Church and the place of Black people within it. Indeed, it became clear to me almost immediately that it would be impossible to narrate the history of Black sisters accurately and honestly without confronting the Church's largely unacknowledged and unreconciled histories of slavery, segregation, and exclusion, and particularly in female religious life. And so for me, what I recognized was that when I was confronted with the silence past of the Black Catholic experience, I knew the most radical thing that I could do, the most important thing that I could do as a historian, was to tell the story that was never meant to be told. And so in order to do that, I had to begin to identify and dismantle several myths that had been used and in certain ways weaponized to silence legitimate demands for racial justice, coming from communities of color, and specifically from the Black Catholic community in the United States. And indeed, I began to sort of ask myself, thinking about my recent calls for Black Catholic historical truth-telling, what would I want to see every Catholic, every member of the faithful know about the US experience, and specifically the place of Black people within it, if they could indeed identify these myths, but also begin to understand and disrupt them and dismantle them. So I want to briefly sort of go through these myths, talk about what is important for us as a church as we continue to reckon and grapple with these histories of white supremacy within the church, and to think about what the stories of Black Catholics can give us as we continue to confront these challenges. So the first myth that I had to encounter, of course, was the myth that Black Catholics in the United States, that their history was inconsequential, and that primarily their story is one sort of situated within the 20th century, and it's primarily a story of conversion, specifically as a result of the great migrations of the 20th century, specifically where African-American Southern migrants entered into the urban North, Midwest, and West. But certainly, of course, I began to encounter the stories of Black sisters, many of whom could trace their lineage to the earliest days of the US Church. Indeed, we know that the history of African and African-descended Catholics in the United States is as old as the history of their European counterparts. In fact, we know that there are two transatlantic stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe and another one that begins in Africa. And indeed, if we take the entire story of the Americas, and certainly what becomes the United States, but the entire sort of story of Latin America and Canada as well, we know that the vast majority of practitioners of Catholicism have been people of African and indigenous descent, not Europeans. In fact, there are Black Catholics in the United States today whose roots predate those of their European counterparts by well over 3 centuries. One fact that I believe that every Catholic should know is that the story of slavery does not begin in 1619, despite popular contention, but instead begins formally in 1565 with the formation of St. Augustine in Florida. In fact, what we know from these early colonial records, not only in Florida, but in Louisiana, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, the names of free and enslaved Black Catholics are inundated in baptismal records, marriage records, the records of the earliest confraternities in the United States. And indeed, the first Christian marriage in the land area that became the United States takes place in Spanish Florida in St. Augustine in 1565 between a free Black domestic servant born in Seville, Spain, who married a Spanish-born soldier in the diocese, or what would become sort of the Diocese of St. Augustine, Florida. And this will be true in many of the nation's earliest churches. Many of the earliest baptismal records or marriage records will be between the church's enslaved and free Black faithful. And indeed, these records are everywhere, and yet we do not oftentimes focus on and acknowledge the foundational African roots of the US Church, despite the fact that their labor, faithfulness, and sales literally built the early church. Many of these individuals are not only sort of descendants, many of the nation's earliest Black sisters are not only the descendants of these African-American Catholics, but many of them can trace their lineage specifically to the earliest European Catholics as well, perhaps most notably Anne Marie Beecraft, who became an early Oblate Sister of Providence, who we know from the historical record was the granddaughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and who was a cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who was the nation's first bishop and the first president of Georgetown College, later University. The other myth that I had to grapple with almost immediately was the myth around the church's involvement in the slave trade and the institution of chattel slavery. So much of the scholarship still says that the church at best was a reluctant and benevolent participant in these systems of discrimination. And yet the reality is the church was the first and the largest slaveholder in the Americas. We know that the vast majority of the earliest bishops, sisters, and lay members supported slavery, would go on to support the Confederacy and uphold white supremacy and segregation in their institutions in the 19th century, and would carry on after the federal abolition of slavery in 1865. Indeed, when we think about the transatlantic slave trade, what stands out to me as a frequent lecturer in Black Catholic history is how many faithful sincerely have no understanding of the church's leading role and participation in this trade. Indeed, so often I have individuals who can tell me about Pope Gregory XVI's famous condemnation of the slave trade in 1839, but who don't sort of recognize that this comes 337 years after the trade began, and also don't begin to sort of understand these earlier papal bulls that sanctioned the slave trade in the 15th century. Those bulls, including those that come from Pope Nicholas V, and also from Pope Alexander VI, which not only sanctioned the development of the transatlantic slave trade, but also sanctioned European invasions of Africa and then later the Americas. So often I call upon Catholic faithful to take trips and make pilgrimages to Elmina Slave Castle in present-day Ghana, because it was the site of the first Roman Catholic chapel in sub-Saharan Africa, but also the site of the first sort of major slave trading port and depot and dungeon. For those who have gone, one knows that the initial Catholic chapel was literally built on top of the slave dungeon. And among many things, this history reminds us that the church was never an innocent bystander in this horrific history. We know that more than 300,000 individuals will pass. For over 300 years, tens of thousands of Africans, enslaved Africans, would pass through these walls of Elmina. And yet it is a history that we do not know, that is not institutionalized. And we oftentimes have to ask ourselves the question of why. And this is true also for many of the nation's earliest convents, monasteries, chapels. Many of them were built with the labor of free and enslaved Black Catholics, certainly the old Ursuline convent in New Orleans, but also other institutions outside of the South that relied upon the labor of enslaved Black Catholics, most notably, or most recently, sort of that has become aware to us, sort of the roots of Loras College in the Diocese of Dubuque in Iowa. We know that many of the earliest ministries were funded by the labor of an enslaved woman owned by the early bishop, Bishop Loras, who rented out an enslaved woman named Mary Louise. And the college is now sort of beginning to sort of grapple with that history. There are other pieces that we have to know. On the one hand, it's something that most Americans will know if you take any sort of course in American history, the story of Roger Taney, who was the nation's first Catholic Supreme Court Justice, who infamously declared in 1857, of course, that Black people, among many things, had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. Most people know about sort of Taney and sort of that particular declaration. Most people, though, don't know that he was Catholic and what that means for the church and its direct complicity in this history of white supremacy. That was the decision that would send Dred Scott, his wife Harriet, and their two daughters back to slavery in Missouri. That being said, I also generally like to point to other examples within Catholic history to help us think about how African-American Catholics also resisted slavery and give us an important counterpoint to understand that Catholic faithful are not only diverse, but also we do have a tradition within the church and specifically within the Black Catholic community of fighting back against those systems. Oftentimes, I like to point attention to the story of Father Augustus Tolton, who is Venerable Augustus Tolton, one of 6 African Americans who are currently under consideration for canonization in the church, who with his family fled slavery, Catholic slavery in Missouri, just a few years after the Taney decision, and successfully made their way and liberated themselves in Quincy, Illinois. Other myths that I had to encounter about the church's engagement with segregation. On the one hand, so often we hear the stories about some Catholic institutions that were in the forefront of racial desegregation. But the reality reminds us, or the reality remains, that the church was indeed the largest Christian practitioner of slavery in the United States. As Father Bryan Massingale has told us in Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, we also know that the bishops were the last of the leaders of the major religious denominations to endorse the Brown decision. And certainly in the historical record, We know that many white Catholics themselves were the foot soldiers of the backlash to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and also greatly opposed the admission of African descended people into religious life well into the 20th century. In the case of the first self-identified Black bishop who was ordained in 1965, he himself will face a contingent of protesters who suggested that he, as a person of color, and specifically a Black man, was not qualified and capable of serving in the position of a bishop. This same contingent of women who protested Bishop Perry's ordination in 1965 led the opposition to the desegregation of public schools in New Orleans in 1960. These were the women who were known as the cheerleaders, again, led by Catholic women who sort of terrorized the young African-American girls who desegregated the public schools in New Orleans for over a year. And then finally, with my own story, and I'm going to end because I know that I'm going over, there is the story that I had to grapple with for myself in terms of telling Black sister stories and what the story of what racism looked like within female religious life. On the one hand, we have wonderful stories of Catholic sisters marching for racial justice in the 1960s. But at the same moment, we also know that there is a history of exclusion and racism within female religious life, beginning from the earliest days of the church. And certainly the cases and stories of the 3 African-American sisters who are currently under consideration for canonization help us to begin to grapple with that history and reckon with that history of slavery and segregation in female religious life through the stories of Servant of God, Mother Mary Lange, who was the foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, that indeed the formation of historically Black orders was made and forced, was forced upon these women simply because they were not allowed to enter white communities. They also faced profound resistance to their presence in the early church, not only from many of the nation's earliest priests and bishops, but also from their female counterparts. Indeed, when we think about some of the opposition that they faced, these stories also force us to grapple with the realities of many of the nation's earliest white female congregational leaders, such as St. Elizabeth Seton, who was herself a slaveholder and a practitioner of segregation, but also reminding us of these examples of resilience and resistance to white supremacy in female religious life, Black women who were born into slavery, who were able to go into religious life through the historically Black orders, first through the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and later after the federal abolition of slavery with the Sisters of the Holy Family. Their stories also remind us of the foundational roots of many of these women, many of whom were the descendants of the earliest settlers of Louisiana, but they themselves also faced profound resistance, being denied the opportunity to wear their habits for the first 40 or 50 years of their existence. And yet they persevere. I think what is ultimately important for us when we think about the power of Black Catholic historical truth-telling are the stories of the descendants of the church's enslaved people who kept the faith, who sent their children into religious life, such as the Burkes of the Holy Land of Kentucky, who were the descendants of the enslaved people who built much of the Holy Land, who will send 5 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. The Prices of Baltimore, who will send 4 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence and 1 son to the Josephite community. The Thomases of Akron, Ohio, who come out of Lebanon, Kentucky, who are the descendants of an enslaved woman owned by the family of Bishop John Lancaster Spalding and Martin Spalding, 2 of the nation's earliest bishops. And then, of course, of the stories of the generation of young sisters like Sister Thea Bowman, who desegregate the nation's historically white sisterhoods, who fight against racism within their communities, sometimes who are subjected to horrific and humiliating segregation, sometimes forced to profess their vows separately from their white counterparts, who have to use and make alliances with white priests who put pressure on communities to open their ranks. And then we get the stories of those who break through. I want to leave you with the story of Sister Cora Marie Billings, who desegregates her community, her Religious Sisters of Mercy community in Philadelphia in 1956, and to give us a sense of that journey forward. Even though she's allowed to break the barrier, she had 2 aunts that were denied admission. Their father was an early pioneering Black layman in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and his father was one of the enslaved men owned by the Jesuits at Georgetown. Ultimately, what I argue is that the history of Black Catholics in the United States gives us the opportunity to remind us that there's always been an articulation of Catholicism that has understood that Black lives matters and has never been too afraid to say that Black lives matter. Indeed, leaving you sort of with the language and sort of the response of Sister Loretta Teresa Richards, who was a longtime superior of the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary, who it was, when I asked her what she thought the greatest legacy of Black Catholics and sisters was in the United States, she did not hesitate. She tells us that the Catholic Church wouldn't be Catholic if it wasn't for us. That not until the Catholic Church, and Black Catholics specifically, put pressure and declared the church to force itself to show its ability to welcome all within their ranks, did the church truly show its capacity for being truly Catholic. And I think that's where I want to leave us, thinking about the power of Black Catholic historical truth-telling and believing that it must be our only way in guiding our future sort of plans and campaigns for racial justice and specifically for racial reparation within the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Our third presenter tonight is Father Bryan Massingale, who is the James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics, as well as the Senior Ethics Fellow in Fordham's Center for Ethics Education. Professor Massingale is a leader in the field of theological ethics. He's the author of Racial Justice in the Catholic Church and is a past convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He is a member of the board of directors of the Society of Christian Ethics and serves on the editorial board of Theological Studies, one of the premier Catholic journals of theology. He also served on the editorial boards of the Journal of Moral Theology and the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, and is a current member and past coordinator of the North American Regional Committee of the Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church Project. In addition to his academic pursuits, Professor Massingale strives to be a scholar activist through serving faith-based groups and advancing justice in society. He's a noted authority on issues of social and racial justice, having addressed numerous national Catholic conferences and lectured at colleges and universities across the nation. He served as a consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, providing theological assistance on issues such as criminal justice, capital punishment, environmental justice, and affirmative action. He's also been a consultant to the National Black Catholic Congress, Catholic Charities USA, the Catholic Health Association, Catholic Relief Services, the Leadership Conference of Religious Women, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, the National Catholic AIDS Network, and the anti-racism teams of Call to Action and Pax Christi USA. He's an active participant in a network of Catholic thought leaders striving for fuller inclusion of LGBT persons in society and the faith community. Father Massingale, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to the community that's gathered for this important conference. I'm honored to be on the panel with my distinguished co-panelists with Bishop Seitz and with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Shannon D. Williams. Every time I listen to you, Shannon, I learn something that I never had any idea about. Father Cyprian, who is kind of the dean of Black Catholic historians, is looking down in glory with pride at who you are. So looking forward to our conversation, our discussion, when we get to the conversation part of this evening. My contribution will be to focus our attention upon the question, what is racism? And to do so using the methodology, the classical methodology of Catholic social teaching, see, judge, act. See what is going on in society, especially that demands a response in the light of the gospel, then looking at the contribution of religious faith to reflect upon that social reality, and then what is it calling us to do? And I want to focus on this question of what is racism, because I think it seems obvious and it's non-controversial to say that Christians are to oppose practices of racist discrimination. But there's less consensus once we drill down and raise the question of what precisely Christians should be opposing. Most Christians, in my experience, tend to adopt what I call a common sense understanding of racism. That is, racism is a matter of individuals acting deliberately, consciously, and intentionally in a negative manner to harm or exclude other individuals on the basis of their racial characteristics, and in particular, skin color. Now, that such obvious and blatant forms of racial animus and discrimination are indeed real. We have not overcome that. But as I say at the bottom of the screen here, this makes racism to be primarily a matter of bad white people or bad white folks. And this kind of racism is indeed a problem, but it's not the problem. It doesn't take us to the heart of the issue. Now, Pope Francis, in his latest document, Fratelli Tutti, gives us an important clue as to understanding racism's deeper meaning. He observes in Fratelli Tutti, and I quote him here, "Racism is a virus that quickly mutates, and instead of disappearing, it goes into hiding and lurks in waiting." That insight resonates with my own work. My insight is that we have to look beneath the visible social institutions, patterns, and policies of a society. We have to look deeper and understand racism as a culture. And I use Canadian philosopher Bernard Lonergan's understanding that culture is a set of meanings and values that inform a community's way of life. Culture is more fundamental than social institutions, policies, and customs. Culture expresses the meaning of society and the significance of the ways in which we order our communities. And the pivotal insight I take from Lonergan is when he says that culture stands to the social order or to society as the soul is to the body. Culture is the spirit that animates social institutions and customs. It makes these visible institution patterns and policies intelligible. It expresses their meaning. And this cultural set of meanings and values can endure despite changes in the visible social institutions. And left unchallenged and unnoted, the underlying cultural values simply adopt new social forms and expressions. On the right side of your screen here, you see the insight of a plant with roots. And I take this from my mother, who was a gardener. She had a garden, and yet her contribution was to decide what would be planted in the garden. But then it came time to do the weeding that would fall to her children, namely her oldest child, me. And I would always want to pick the visible weeds out, and so it would look good. And my mother's insight was, no, you have to go back and redo it and pull it up by the roots, because unless you pull the weed up by its roots, it's simply going to grow back. Culture is the fertile soil and the root. Society is the visible social institutions and patterns. These social institutions and patterns can change, but culture is carried through socialization and often non-consciously. I argue for a more cultural systemic understanding of racism. Racism is a deeply entrenched symbol system of meanings and values attached to skin color. And a cultural significance that we attach to skin color shapes group identities, it shapes personal consciousness, and it also justifies the existence of race-based economic, social, and political disparities. Those specific disparities may change over time, but unless the underlying culture is interrogated, the system of values we attach to skin color is interrogated, then it will simply reassert itself in new ways. This underlying culture carried through socialization is the root conviction that Black people are not human, not fully, really, truly. And that underlying that cultural conviction is that there's a presumption of white dominance and entitlement. The visible forms that these convictions take may change, but the fundamental framing and the fundamental interpretation of skin color differences endures, reflecting pervasive anxieties and fears. Now, because racism is a culture, it often operates on below the level of conscious awareness. It's present in individuals more as an inchoate feeling or an intuitive conviction or an reflexive action. Let me give 3 examples to kind of make this plain. At the height of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, a controversy arose because 2 photographs of the event showing people doing the exact same thing at the exact same time and the exact same circumstance were described in very different ways. In the top photograph, you see a young man wading through water with a satchel full of goods behind him, and the caption from the Associated Press reads, "A young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30, 2005. In the bottom photograph, you see 2 people also wading through water, also with satchels of goods, but here the press assigns a different caption. It reads, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. Now, neither of these parties paid for the goods that are in their possession. One described as looting, the other described as finding. After howls of protest, the photographs were removed from the internet, obviously not successfully, as you can see, but it shows how the pervasive framing that we've attached to skin color differences leads us to interpret people doing the same thing at the same time in very different ways. And it wasn't as if the editor sat down and said, oh, he's Black, he's obviously looting. Oh, they're white, he's obviously finding. These were things that traded on what we all know, the true common sense. But we don't need to go back to Katrina to see this. At the height of the protest over the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, a controversy arose because a Black Latino CNN reporter was arrested on air while doing a live reporting of protests in Minneapolis, while a white CNN reporter, his colleague, who was doing the same thing at the same time in the same neighborhood, was treated with consummate politeness. And even his colleagues back in the CNN headquarters anchor booth had to say that the only difference between the two was the color of their skin. Or more to the point, the controversy over the remarks of Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican senator from my home state of Wisconsin, who described the differences in his reactions, that he said he didn't feel any fear when white violence broke out on January 6th in the insurrection and he had to be rushed to safety. But he said he would have felt differently if these were Black Lives Matter protesters. He said, even though there are thousands of people marching to the Capitol who are trying to pressure people like me to vote the way they wanted me to vote, I knew these were people who love this country, who truly respect law enforcement, would never do anything to break the law, and so I wasn't concerned. But had the tables been turned, had these been 10,000s of Black Lives Matter protesters, I might have been a little concerned. People like me. We are socialized in this country to accept white male violence as being legitimate. Or it may even be outrageous, but it's never a cause of terror and fear. That's how Black bodies are coded. And again, I'm not saying that Ron Johnson is a deliberate, conscious racist. I don't know his heart. I'm saying he reflects the pervasive socialization that all of us have experienced, the underlying set of meanings and values that are attached to skin color. This leads us to understand the effects of the culture shock happening in this country as its racial demography is changing, that leads us to white nationalism. The effects of a culture shock as the nation is being transformed in ways in which white people find anxiety producing and fearful, leading mobs to march through Charlottesville chanting, "You will not replace us," leading a president to identify himself as an explicit nationalist. But note what nationalism means. It's a non-rational, instinctual, visceral conviction that the country, its public spaces, its political institutions, its cultural heritage, that all of these belong to people in a way that they do not and should not belong to others. That white nationalism is not a matter of hate in the first instance, but a matter of belonging. Whose country is this? Whose church is this? Whose religious community is this? Who really belongs? And white nationalism becomes expressed in hatred when that conviction of belonging, white belonging, becomes under threat or challenged. And so, as we saw in January 6th, as we see in the matching t-shirts, we saw Trump rallies. What white nationalism leads to is the conviction that many white Americans would rather live in a white dictatorship than in a multiracial democracy. That if democracy means sharing political power with people of color, and especially Black Americans, then it's not worth it because white is coded as superior and Black is coded as unworthy, fearful, inferior. And with that then, January 6th is the inexorable outcome of this pervasive white coding, of this pervasive culture. It's not enough to look at the individual actors. These actors are not aberrations. They are reflections of an underlying cultural system. So then what does Catholic social teaching offer us here? And here we have to be honest about contributions and blind spots. When we look at white nationalism, we have to understand that white Catholics are supporters of white nationalism. We have to understand that a majority of white Catholics voted for Trump in 2016. And we usually explain that away by saying that they were moved by his support for pro-life. We can interrogate that in more detail later. But research shows otherwise. Research shows that Trump's stances on immigration and race were far more important and determinative for white support than his stance on life issues. And in his final rallies, his closing arguments he made to the American people for re-election, he hardly mentioned any commitment to life, but he made explicit appeals to racism and immigration, repeated appeals to guard our borders against illegals, protecting our people and your suburbs. And we have to face the fact that a supermajority of white Catholics supported his re-election, and not simply because of pro-life. Looking at Catholic social teaching in this country on racism, we see some rather disturbing patterns I need to call our attention to. That in the latest document of the US bishops from 2018, Open Wide Our Hearts, their pastoral letter on racism, they say forthrightly that love compels each of us to resist racism courageously. And they call attention to the fact that in 1999, Pope John Paul II called racism a life issue. But when we look at the document more deeply, we see some disturbing silences. There's no mention of white nationalism. They talk about nationalism, but they never identify as being white. There's no mention of white privilege. The phrase never appears in the document. There's no mention of the Black Lives Matter movement, despite the fact that this movement had been a reality in American life since 2013, 5 years prior to the issuance of this document. You would never know that there was a social movement in America called Black Lives Matter if your only source of information was the bishop's pastoral letter. There's no mention of Asian Americans, especially troubling given the resurgence of anti-Asian hate with irresponsible political rhetoric over the COVID crisis and the recent killings in Atlanta. And when white people are present, they're either absent or they're present as a passive role or as saviors. Injustices happen, but they never say who are the agents of these injustices or why these injustices occur. There's furthermore muted rhetoric when we examine what they specifically say about police violence, and this is worth noting in detail. They say, we must admit the plain truth that many of our fellow citizens who have done nothing wrong and their interactions with police are often fraught with fear and even danger. At the same time, we reject harsh rhetoric that belittles and dehumanizes law enforcement personnel who labor to keep our community safe. We also condemn violent attacks against police. The fact that citizens of color are disadvantaged by the police, which is putting it very mildly, is simply admitted. What's rejected is harsh rhetoric against law enforcement. What's condemned are attacks against police. The only place in the document where a condemnation appears is in defense of police. Those police practices are never subjected to the same level of scrutiny. What we see in Catholic social teaching in the United States is a constant privileging of white comfort. White comfort sets the limits of Catholic engagement with the injustice of racism. I've listed here many ways, anecdotal experiences that I have had when we've been talking about white comfort. My favorite being the fourth bullet point, when I was talking to a group of major superiors of men, and one asked me the question, we're a German province. We love our German heritage and we're proud of our German character. Now, how can we attract Black men to our order? Note, white comfort sets the limits of Catholic engagement. Or to put it more directly, there's a normative whiteness in the Catholic Church, which inhibits forthright conversation and engagement with the sin of racism. The Church is unable or unwilling to interrogate this normative whiteness. And what I mean by normative whiteness, quoting my own work, unfortunately, is that what makes the Church white and racist is the pervasive belief that European aesthetics, music, theology, and persons, and only these, are standard, normative, universal, and truly Catholic. Black nuns are not truly Catholic. Black priests are not truly Catholic. Gospel music is not truly Catholic. This normative whiteness is the greatest obstacle to the Church's engagement with the sin of racism. I want to conclude on looking at two ways of going forward. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti talks about the need to cultivate a penitential memory, a penitential memory. My penitential memory, I go back to the sacrament of penance. And in the rite of sacrament of penance, it begins with an honest examination of conscience. An honest call for Catholics as individuals and as a faith community to name where they have failed, both in what they have done and in what we have failed to do. That penitential memory is a theological way of talking about what Dr. Williams said about the need for honest truth-telling. We cannot achieve racial reconciliation unless we first tell the truth and confront the truth of Catholic complicity in the sin of racism. And then we also need to dwell in that space of contrition, as Bishop Seitz was talking about, because the rite of penance says very clearly that one of the key elements of the essential, an essential element, I'm quoting here, of the conversion process depends upon heartfelt sorrow and aversion for the sin committed. And oftentimes social groups engage in only superficial actions tailored to address an immediate crisis and to put it behind them. They never make an effective commitment to racial justice because they have never been genuinely sorry for the harms perpetrated in their midst. And then we know in the rite of penance, there's a call for acts of penance, reparation, restitution. And this is not that radical. When I was a child preparing for the sacrament of reconciliation, I was clearly taught that there are certain sins that the absolution was contingent upon one's willingness to make restitution for the harm that one was done. If you stole, you had to return what you stole. If you lied about someone, you had to repair the damage that your lies had caused. We need to have ways of bringing that sacramental wisdom into a social register for authentic racial reconciliation. And finally, Pope Francis talks about what he calls a polyhedral solidarity. I confess I don't really know what he means by this term, but I think what he means by a polyhedral solidarity is that just as differences come together and make a composite that is greater than the sum of its parts, only when we truly value the various components of our humanity can we then build that beloved community, that earthly manifestation of the reign of God, which is our hope, our promise, and our challenge. Thank you.
Father Massingale, thank you so much for the presentation, and also Dr. Williams and Bishop Seitz, thank you very much. We do have some time for some conversation, and I wanted to begin with a question. Father Massingale, I'll start by directing this to you, but all three of our presenters, please feel free to share the insights. Your presentation organized around this notion of see, judge, and act. Presumably, we are gathered with over 100 people that have a desire to be able not just to see, but also to know what it means to judge rightly, to discern rightly, as well as act. But I was drawn to that image at the beginning of your presentation, Father Massingale, where you talked about picking the visible weeds, and so that we look good. And there is, of course, the temptation when we think about action to settle for maybe picking the visible weeds so that we look good and not really digging down to the roots. And I wondered, maybe first with you and then all of our presenters, could you give us some guidance on how to avoid picking the visible weeds, or maybe some examples of things that you've seen that's not getting to the root that we need to avoid?
Yeah, that's a really broad question, and so we could have a whole presentation just on that question. So I'm just going to start small and talk about what I would call performative solidarity, when people engage in actions that kind of say that they're woke. And we saw some of that with the Black Lives Matter protests this summer, when people blackened their Instagram squares as kind of an act of solidarity. And again, small acts are good, but it's like, okay, if it starts there and ends there, that's just picking up the visible root, the visible weed. I think the question, a really deep question, comes down to, as I challenge my students, I tell them, how do you use your privilege to challenge privilege? Because I tell my students, you know, you're going to see and hear a lot more raw racial animus than I do, because when I'm in the room, everyone knows how to act. There are certain things that are going to be said, and there are certain things that won't be said. But when, you know, when white people are among themselves in a safe group, what are you going to do when your family members, when your friends tell racist off-color jokes? Because when we create safe spaces for that to fester, all that negative speech creates the groundwork from where more severe forms of discrimination and animus spring from. And so if you're not willing to use your privilege when you're in that situation to say, that's not funny, or I don't agree, or you're not willing to speak up, then, you know, yeah, you can, you know, blacken your Instagram square, okay? You can send out a tweet or retweet something, fine. But if you're not willing to use your privilege to challenge privilege, especially when you're white and other white people, and research has shown that white Americans will not challenge other white Americans because they want to preserve relationships of, you know, we want to get along with our family, we want to get along with our friends, we don't want to, and we make excuses like, oh, that was the way they were raised, or, you know, he's of a different generation, or deep down they're really good people. I think white people, we really want to start getting at some real deep action. We need to start interrogating, what do we mean by a good person? I think that's a good start right there.
Yeah, thank you.
Wisdom. I mean, yeah, I think are you willing to use your privilege to challenge privilege? Are you willing to challenge, to be the person that speaks up? Anyone can be an ally when you're around other Black people. Are you willing to be an ally when you're around other white people?
Yeah, that's good. Not creating safe space was something that you said in there too. Not creating safe space for white supremacy.
Right, because white supremacy isn't always wearing, you know, it's not walking through Charlottesville with a tiki torch, okay? White supremacy is carried in the everyday actions. And the other thing I would challenge, I mean, I'm speaking as a priest. I've been a priest now for 38 years. And in the time I've been a priest, I've only had one white person ever confess the sin of racism in the sacrament of penance. Now, you can't tell me that this country continues because there's only one white person who keeps it all going. So let's start there.
Yeah.
We were talking about, you know, Bishop Seitz present, we're in a season of Lent. Yes, absolutely. We got one more week left. Okay. Let's start there. I'll stop. I can go on forever, so I'm gonna stop right there.
And if I just would add on to Father Massingale's point, when we think about the church itself, when I began my research, I really didn't understand what I was getting into. When I began telling Black sisters stories, stories of rejections into communities, you know, it almost immediately, I did a talk in London, and I told the story of Sister N. Martin de Porres Gray, who was the foundress of the National Black Sisters Conference. Although she was Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy, she had been rejected admission into the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden, Pennsylvania, before she was admitted to the Religious Sisters of Mercy. And a member of that community was there, and they were horrified to know about their community's anti-Black admissions policies. And so for me, and certainly with my own research, I encourage every religious community. So often we sort of point to these images of Catholic sisters marching for racial justice in the 1960s. It's really interesting, right? The question, of course, is what were their stories like in their communities? What were the experiences of the pioneering Black women in those communities? What happened to them? There are communities, certainly I didn't get into it in my presentation in great detail, but some of these communities who are grappling with their histories of white supremacy, of their intentional exclusion of Black women, and to understand too, they would take other women of color. They would take women who were of Asian descent, who were of Native American descent, who were Latinx from the very beginning. And so Blackness was the bar. So for these communities, we have sort of a documentation in their general council minutes, the votes that were taken, whether or not they felt comfortable admitting a Black woman, whether or not they were going to live equally with her, that those records are with us. And so for me, I always encourage individuals to sort of look at their own story. If your community does not have any African descended members, why is that? Did you teach African American children? Are you suggesting that none of those girls had vocations? What are the stories there that we are not hearing? What are the lived experiences of the nations historically, of Black women who entered into religious life? Even when we sort of celebrate the story of someone like Sister Thea Bowman, what is concerning to me, among many things, is that we forget that she dies very young, and that many of her peers, white and Black, say that her experiences of racism in religious life, and she went in at 15 and endured unconscionable racism from the women in her community, that killed her. And it killed a lot of pioneering Black sisters and priests in religious life. Those things are documented, it's real. And this was even before we sort of knew the health cost of racism. And so what I also say is, we actually do know this history. And the one last thing that I want to say when we talk about reparations, when I've been in the archives, say, for example, these histories of these communities that have slavery. So often now in this current conversation, it's like, well, Black Catholics didn't know this history. We're sort of saying that people are rediscovering this history. And I am very uneasy with that, because the archival record tells us, say, for example, the Sisters of Loretto in Kentucky, if you go into those archives, every 6 months or so, the descendants of the enslaved people that are buried at that mother house would come back to the mother house and ask the sisters if they could come and tend to the graves of their ancestors. And they did this through the Jim Crow era. They would come back every 6 months. It was the daughters, the granddaughters of these enslaved people who were buried at the mother house, and would ask the sisters, and the sisters would allow them to go and tend the graves of their ancestors. So this question of, we didn't know this history, it wasn't with us, it's been with us, it's documented everywhere. So the question now, of course, is, I'm someone who has seen this history and said that it matters, but there have been a lot of people who have seen these records and for a very long time sort of said, I'm not going to touch that, right? Because it really sort of challenges us in a very different way about the church. But I think for me, it's not about what the church did, but rather sort of what did it fail to do? Because we do know that the church was the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas, and we do know that it was the largest practitioner of segregation. Those things aren't up for debate. So the question, of course, is, what are those experiences from the people who suffered under those conditions? And those are the stories that we also have to tell.
And take seriously. Thank you so much for that response. Bishop Seitz, I have a question for you. This is from one of the participants viewing online. The question is, what will it take for a predominantly white clergy to begin to address issues of racial justice in a deep and meaningful way from the pulpit?
Good question. There's so many issues that the clergy, we would like to see the clergy address. And I think there is a reticence on the part of many clergy to get into areas that are considered controversial, that will cause some negative feedback on behalf of their congregations. There's a real hesitance there, and I think fundamentally, we in the church, we always stand in need of conversion, right? And a lot of times we might tend to think that priests and bishops don't need conversion. Maybe nobody in this group thinks that, but that's a kind of common tendency. The truth is, of course, that the church is always in need of conversion, and that means all of the members to receive the gospel and to speak it in ways that aren't merely niceties to make people feel better when they come, but to deeply challenge them about their own sinfulness, yes, personally, but also to make them aware of structures in society that are also unjust and need to be repented of in our work as a community. What will it take? I don't know. More suffering, more work on behalf of the Holy Spirit. And just one thing I would say is that don't underestimate the ability of the Holy Spirit to bring that about. And it begins, as long as we, both clergy and laity, sit back and wait for somebody else to do it, it ain't gonna happen, right? But those of us who become aware should be deeply rooted in the gospel, in the teaching of the church, and recognize the ways that those teachings apply to our daily life, then we'll be living the faith. It's got to start with each of us, and that hopefully it goes from there.
Thank you.
Could jump in. Thank you, Bishop, for that. One of the things that when I talk to priests anecdotally is that when you ask them what their weakest courses in their seminary formation were, they'll say their course in Catholic social teaching and their courses in preaching. Now, for most of the lady, they'll say, you're not telling us anything we haven't already experienced. We know the preaching is not a strong suit for most Catholic clergy. So when you put those together, asking priests to preach about social justice is going into the weakest suit that we have in our seminary formation. So I think one thing we need to do is look at seminary formation and what's going on in terms of what is Catholic social teaching? How is it being taught? How are we then teaching people how to preach on this? But then I think we also need to look at the spiritual formation of the clergy in terms of what does it mean to have a genuine paschal spirituality? Are we willing to die for the sake of the gospel? And dying for the sake of the gospel doesn't have to mean physically, but it means at times having people, be mad at us or blog about us. I often say that if Jesus was rewriting the Beatitudes today, he'd say, "Blessed are ye they when they insult you and persecute you and blog about you for my sake." Okay, I mean, we need to actually, I really wonder about seminary formation and whether we're training people to be pious in the worst sense of that word, of an individual spirituality that is divorced from accompanying the poor and being willing to lay down one's life, metaphorically and reputationally, for the sake of the poor. I just wonder.
I can say just one last thing.
Please do.
When I say tell Black Catholic history and tell Black Catholic stories, part of what happens too is that we recover these moments in which white Catholics did step forward and do some really amazing things. Like there are so many examples where Black women are able to desegregate a community because white sisters in the community sort of fight against sort of the racism within their community. Sort of one community in California, a pioneer Black sister in California, Sister Martin DePorres Coleman, is able to desegregate her community in 1952 because two of her former educators threatened to leave the community if she is not admitted. So because we don't tell the truth about Black Catholic history, we've missed those stories of courageous moments, of sisters leaving communities and founding their own communities that will be completely inclusive to women regardless of color. So we do have those stories as well of white priests who sort of put themselves on the line to sort of force communities to open, to force institutions to open, to force Catholic colleges and universities to open prior to the Brown decision in the 1920s and 30s, so the members of the historically Black sisterhoods can accredit their schools. There are all these amazing stories, these moments of not simply racial cooperation, but racial justice, and these moments when we believe that the church was not sort of involved at all, but we don't get those stories because we don't tell the truth about Black Catholics. And so for me, it's not simply sort of pointing out the ways in which the church has been complicit or been sort of a leading agent in these histories, these painful histories, but there are also these moments in which Catholics have come together in profound ways and moved mountains. But because we don't tell the truth about Black Catholics, we can't even begin to sort of point to this blueprint that is already within our tradition, that is always here with us. And so even when we think about something that Dr. Massingale said, when we don't even think about sort of the spirituals as Catholic tradition, if we tell the story of Augustus Tolton, he tells us that he learned at the knees of his mother praying and singing, and she taught him the spirituals. We know from the historical record that Black Catholic soldiers in the Union Army were singing the spirituals. They are not Protestant traditions. They are traditions that come out of the experience of the enslaved, and that is a Catholic tradition. But because we don't know this history, we're not getting it right. And so for me, at least, if we tell this true truth, what Sister Thea Bowman, servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman told us to do, and to tell the true truth about the church, then maybe we can begin to sort of have these truths that will guide us as we move forward. But that's what I'll say. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much, as well as thank you, Father Massingale and Bishop Seitz. There is a lot to chew on, and unfortunately we are out of time, but I want to thank each of you so much the insight and the expertise that you brought. I feel like we are both enlightened and deeply challenged with this. And so thank you to everyone for joining us at the first session here of the 2021 CST conference. And we will begin again tomorrow at 11 a.m. We are having a panel thinking about creating a global vision of justice, thinking about major injustices that have to be addressed at a global level. So you can access the panel through the same Zoom link through the Center for Social Concerns website. But as we sign off, one more time, thank you so much to our presenters. It was a great, great beginning. Have a good night, everyone.